What if the most hated man in Christian history was never meant to be a villain at all? Imagine standing in the dim light of an ancient archive. Around you lie fragments of forgotten manuscripts, their edges blackened by time, their words buried beneath centuries of dust, controversy, and silence. Somewhere among them rests a question that has refused to die for nearly 2,000 years. A question hidden behind sermons, paintings, and traditions so familiar that few people ever think to challenge them. We all know the name: Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the man whose kiss became one of the most infamous symbols of treachery ever recorded. At least, that is the story history remembers. But history is often shaped by the voices that survive, not necessarily by the voices that were right. Now imagine that beneath the sands of Egypt, a forgotten manuscript emerges from the darkness. A text lost for centuries. A text carrying a shocking claim. According to its pages, Judas was not the enemy of Jesus. He was the only disciple who truly understood him. Suddenly, the familiar story begins to crack. Was Judas a traitor, or was he carrying out a task no other disciple was willing to perform? Was he driven by greed, as tradition tells us? Or did he play a role in a mystery far larger than himself? The deeper we investigate, the stranger the evidence becomes. Ancient texts disagree. Early Christians argued fiercely. Scholars remain divided. And beneath all of it lies an unsettling paradox. If the crucifixion was necessary for salvation, then what exactly was Judas guilty of? Tonight, we are not searching for a villain. We are opening a door sealed for centuries. Behind it waits one of the most controversial questions in the history of religion. And before this investigation is over, we may discover that the real mystery was never Judas himself, but why so many generations needed him to be the traitor. To understand how the name Judas became one of the most feared names in religious history, we must leave behind the world we know and return to a narrow strip of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean nearly 2,000 years ago. The Roman Empire ruled the region with iron authority. Its legions marched across stone roads. Its governors collected taxes. Its banners hung over cities that spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. Yet beneath the power of Rome, another force was shaping the lives of ordinary people. Hope. Judea was a land saturated with expectation. Ancient prophecies were recited in synagogues illuminated by oil lamps. Pilgrims traveled dusty roads toward Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the Jewish world. Many believed history itself was approaching a turning point. Foreign empires had come and gone: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and now Rome. Yet the promises preserved in sacred texts remained. Somewhere in the future, God would intervene. A deliverer would come. A kingdom would be restored. In this atmosphere of longing, religious movements flourished. Pharisees debated the interpretation of sacred law. Sadducees maintained authority around the temple. Mystical communities withdrew into the wilderness seeking purity and divine revelation. Apocalyptic preachers warned that the present age was nearing its end. It was a world alive with visions, expectations, and competing understandings of what God was about to do. Into this landscape stepped Jesus of Nazareth. Historical sources suggest that he gathered followers, traveled through towns and villages, and proclaimed the coming kingdom of God. Among those followers was a man called Judas Iscariot. Yet here we encounter our first difficulty. The historical record reveals remarkably little about him. Beyond the gospel accounts, Judas appears only as a shadow moving through the margins of the story. We do not possess letters written by him. We have no testimony preserved in his own voice. Almost everything known about Judas comes through texts written by others. This raises an important question. When we think we know Judas, are we seeing the historical man? Or are we seeing the image that later communities created around him? The evidence cannot yet answer, but it reminds us of something essential. Before Judas became a symbol of betrayal, before artists painted him with darkened features and theologians debated his fate, he was a man living in a world charged with expectation, fear, political tension, and religious hope. And it was within that world that one of history's greatest mysteries first began to take shape. Now let us step away from the historical record for a moment and enter the world of images, because long before most people ever read a line about Judas, they first encountered him through sacred art. Imagine standing inside a candlelit church somewhere in medieval Europe. The air is heavy with incense. Shadows tremble across stone walls darkened by centuries of smoke. Above the altar, illuminated by flickering light, unfolds a scene repeated countless times across the Christian world. At the center stands Jesus. His garments glow with deep crimson and luminous gold. Around his head rests a radiant halo, a circle of unbroken light representing divine authority and eternal presence. The architecture surrounding him seems almost weightless, as though heaven itself is pressing gently against the boundaries of earth. Then your eyes move toward another figure. He is often placed at the edge of the composition, not fully inside the sacred circle, not fully outside it. Judas. In many ancient paintings, his robes are painted in muted yellows, dull browns, or fading greens, colors that separate him from the vibrant harmony surrounding Christ and the other disciples. His face is frequently turned at a different angle. His gaze drifts away from the center. Sometimes his halo is absent altogether. Sometimes it appears darkened. Sometimes a shadow seems to cling to him even when light touches every other figure in the scene. Yet the closer we examine these images, the stranger they become. In the famous depictions of the Last Supper, Judas is often shown reaching toward the same table as Christ. The same bread, the same cup, the same sacred moment. He is separated, yet included, condemned, yet present. In scenes depicting the kiss in Gethsemane, the composition becomes even more unsettling. Two faces move toward one another, one illuminated by serenity, the other burdened by an expression artists struggled to define for centuries. Is it guilt, fear, determination, sorrow? The image never fully answers. And perhaps that ambiguity is the most important symbol of all, because sacred art was never simply recording an event. It was interpreting it. Each brushstroke reflected a theological judgment. Each color carried meaning. Each architectural detail reinforced a narrative about betrayal and redemption. Yet standing before these ancient images today, another possibility begins to emerge. What if the paintings reveal not only what medieval Christians believed about Judas, but also what they feared? What if the darkness surrounding him tells us as much about the imagination of later generations as it does about the man himself? The image remains motionless upon the wall. Yet the closer we look, the less certain its message becomes. The deeper we move into the story of Judas, the more we discover that the real conflict was never between one man and one teacher. It was a conflict between competing visions of reality itself. By the 2nd century, the movement that began in the hills and villages of Roman Judea had spread across the Mediterranean world. Communities of believers gathered in homes, courtyards, and hidden meeting places from Syria to Egypt, from Asia Minor to Rome. Yet these communities did not all tell the same story. They shared many of the same names: Jesus, Peter, John, Judas, but they often disagreed about what those names meant. The historical record shows that early Christianity was far more diverse than later generations sometimes imagined. Some groups emphasized the physical resurrection of Christ. Others focused on spiritual revelation. Some believed salvation came through faith and divine grace. Others argued that hidden knowledge was the key to liberation. These disagreements were not minor theological details. They touched the very foundations of existence. What is the material world? Who created it? Why do human beings suffer? What did Jesus actually come to accomplish? Within this turbulent intellectual landscape, Judas became a surprisingly important figure. In what would later become the dominant Christian tradition, Judas represented betrayal. His actions served as a warning about greed, disloyalty, and spiritual failure. The narrative was clear, powerful, and morally coherent. Yet other communities saw something entirely different. Certain Gnostic groups interpreted the relationship between Jesus and Judas through a radically different lens. In their reading, Judas was not the disciple who understood the least. He was the disciple who understood the most. The evidence for this interpretation survives in texts such as the Gospel of Judas, where secret conversations replace public teachings and hidden revelation becomes more important than outward appearances. Some scholars argue that these alternative traditions emerged because different Christian communities were attempting to answer the same theological questions in different ways. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation is that it can sometimes underestimate how sharply these groups disagreed with one another. The conflict was not merely about Judas. It was about authority. Which teachings came from the apostles? Which texts preserved authentic tradition? Which interpretation of Jesus would define the future of Christianity? As church leaders sought unity, certain texts gained authority while others gradually disappeared from public use. Yet the archaeological record reminds us that disappearance is not the same as absence. Forgotten manuscripts occasionally re-emerge from deserts and caves, carrying voices that history almost erased. This raises a deeper question. When two ancient communities preserve radically different portraits of the same individual, are we witnessing a dispute over historical memory or a struggle over the meaning of salvation itself? At this stage of the investigation, the evidence allows neither possibility to be dismissed. Both remain standing before us, waiting to be examined more closely. The investigation now leads us away from cathedrals, councils, and public traditions into a quieter place. A world of hidden manuscripts, damaged papyrus, forgotten libraries, and voices that survived only by accident. This is where the Gospel of Judas enters the story, not as a rival to the canonical Gospels in terms of historical proximity, but as a witness to a very different stream of religious thought. The text itself is strange from the very beginning. Instead of focusing primarily on miracles, parables, or public teachings, it presents a series of private conversations between Jesus and Judas. The atmosphere feels almost secretive, as though the reader has stumbled upon a discussion never intended for a wider audience. One of the most intriguing details appears in the way Jesus interacts with the other disciples. In several passages, he laughs, not with joy, not with mockery in the ordinary sense. Rather, he appears to laugh because the disciples misunderstand the true nature of the divine world. Some scholars argue that this motif reflects a distinctly Gnostic worldview in which spiritual ignorance, rather than moral failure, is humanity's greatest problem. Others caution that such interpretations depend heavily upon fragmentary passages and damaged sections of the manuscript. The difficulty is that parts of the text remain incomplete, leaving room for multiple readings. Then comes the passage that has generated the greatest controversy. Jesus tells Judas that he will exceed the other disciples because he will sacrifice the man that clothes me. The phrase is mysterious. Some scholars interpret it as a reference to Judas facilitating the separation of Jesus' divine identity from his physical body, an idea consistent with certain Gnostic beliefs about spirit and matter. Others remain unconvinced. They argue that the language is symbolic and cannot be used to reconstruct a historical relationship between Jesus and Judas. The strongest evidence suggests that the text reflects theological speculation rather than eyewitness testimony. Yet the manuscript contains other fascinating details. It describes complex heavenly realms, luminous generations of divine beings, and cosmic structures largely absent from the canonical Gospels. The world presented in the text is vast, layered, and difficult to navigate. Salvation appears less like forgiveness of sin and more like awakening from a cosmic sleep. Within such a framework, Judas occupies a role unlike any found in traditional Christian narratives. But this raises a deeper question. Does the Gospel of Judas preserve an alternative memory of Judas himself, or does it simply use his name as a literary vehicle for expressing Gnostic theology? The archaeological record cannot fully answer. The historical evidence remains limited. What we possess is not a window opened directly onto the first century, but a manuscript that reveals how at least one community interpreted the meaning of Judas generations later. Yet, even with those limitations, the text remains remarkable. It reminds us that beneath the familiar story preserved by tradition existed a hidden world of competing ideas, forgotten interpretations, and theological possibilities that almost vanished from history altogether. At this point in our investigation, the question is no longer simply whether Judas betrayed Jesus. The deeper question is why ancient authors and religious communities chose to make Judas symbolize such radically different things. Symbols are rarely accidental. In the ancient world, names, actions, numbers, and narrative roles often carried layers of meaning beyond the surface of the story. To understand Judas, we must examine him not only as a historical figure, but also as a symbol moving through the imagination of early Christianity. Let us begin with the most famous symbol associated with him, the 30 pieces of silver. Historically, The amount may reflect references to older Hebrew traditions involving compensation, servitude, and prophetic imagery. Theologically, it became a symbol of misplaced loyalty and the tragic exchange of spiritual value for material gain. Yet the symbolism becomes more complex when viewed through the lens of alternative traditions. In the Gospel of Judas, the central symbol is not silver, but knowledge. Judas is no longer defined by what he receives. He is defined by what he understands. This shift reveals a profound difference between two theological systems. In one, the greatest danger is moral failure. In the other, the greatest danger is spiritual ignorance. The evidence suggests that these competing symbols emerged from competing understandings of salvation itself. Another important symbol is the kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane. Historically, a kiss was a common gesture of greeting, loyalty, and recognition in the ancient Mediterranean world. Yet within the gospel narratives, that familiar gesture becomes transformed into one of the most haunting symbols in religious literature. A sign of intimacy becomes a sign of betrayal. A gesture meant to identify friendship becomes the mechanism through which an arrest begins. Literary scholars have long noted the power of this inversion. The symbol works precisely because it violates expectation. But there is another layer worth considering. Some interpreters argue that Judas functions as what literary theorists call the necessary outsider, the individual who stands at the boundary between two worlds and whose actions trigger a larger transformation. Similar figures appear throughout ancient literature. They are often condemned by the community while simultaneously becoming essential to the unfolding of the story. This does not prove that Judas was secretly a hero. The historical evidence cannot support such a conclusion. Yet it helps explain why alternative traditions could reinterpret his role so dramatically. Archaeological discoveries from Egypt, including Gnostic manuscripts found near Nag Hammadi, reveal a symbolic universe very different from that of emerging Orthodox Christianity. In those texts, the visible world often appears as a shadow of deeper realities. Hidden knowledge becomes a pathway to liberation. Within such a framework, Judas could be transformed from a cautionary figure into a bearer of secret insight. The difficulty with this interpretation is that it reflects a theological system developed generations after the events themselves. Yet the symbolism remains revealing. It tells us how different communities understood the relationship between knowledge, sacrifice, and redemption. My reading of the evidence is that Judas became a symbolic battlefield upon which early Christians debated some of the largest questions imaginable. What saves a human being? Faith, obedience, knowledge, sacrifice? The symbol changed because the questions changed. And perhaps that is why the figure of Judas continues to fascinate historians, theologians, and literary scholars alike. He is not merely a character within the story. He is a mirror reflecting the deepest concerns of those who tell it. Every historical investigation eventually reaches a point where the familiar path ends and the more controversial terrain begins. In the case of Judas, that moment arrives when we encounter a question that many ancient believers considered deeply unsettling. What if Judas did not misunderstand Jesus at all? What if he understood something that the other disciples did not? This interpretation has never been the dominant view within Christianity. In fact, for most of Christian history, it remained marginalized, criticized, or dismissed altogether. Yet the historical record shows that it existed, and that alone makes it worthy of examination. The strongest evidence for this alternative reading comes from the Gospel of Judas itself. Within that text, Judas occupies a position unlike the one found in the canonical Gospels. Rather than being portrayed primarily as a thief or a traitor, he appears as a recipient of private revelations. Jesus separates him from the other disciples and shares teachings not given to the rest. Some scholars argue that this literary structure was designed to elevate Judas as the only disciple capable of understanding the true nature of Christ's mission. Others remain unconvinced. They point out that the text was written within a specific Gnostic environment and reflects theological concerns that emerged long after the historical Judas lived. The difficulty with treating the Gospel of Judas as historical evidence is that it tells us more about the beliefs of its authors than about the events of first-century Judea. Yet the interpretation itself remains fascinating because of what it attempts to solve. Consider the paradox we encountered earlier. If the crucifixion was necessary for salvation, then someone had to set the events in motion. Some ancient readers saw a contradiction in condemning Judas, while simultaneously affirming the necessity of the outcome his actions helped produce. Their solution was radical. They reimagined Judas not as the enemy of the divine plan, but as its most difficult participant. In this interpretation, Judas becomes a tragic figure, not a hero, not a saint, but someone asked to perform an act that would guarantee his own condemnation by future generations. This idea never gained broad acceptance, and there are significant reasons why. The canonical sources consistently portray Judas negatively. Early Christian writers overwhelmingly rejected attempts to rehabilitate his image. The historical evidence supporting the traditional view is both earlier and more widespread. Yet the forbidden interpretation persisted because it addressed a question that would not disappear. How should responsibility be understood when an apparently evil action contributes to a larger good? Similar dilemmas appear throughout ancient literature, philosophy, and theology. The Gospel of Judas offers one possible answer, but not necessarily a definitive one. My reading of the evidence is that the value of this interpretation lies less in whether it accurately describes the historical Judas and more in what it reveals about the minds of those who proposed it. They were wrestling with the relationship between destiny and choice, between appearance and reality, between condemnation and necessity. And perhaps that is why the debate continues. Because beneath the question of who Judas was lies a deeper and more uncomfortable question. Can history ever fully distinguish between the villain of a story and the person required for that story to unfold? At this stage of the investigation, we arrive at the point where the evidence branches into two competing paths. Both are supported by ancient texts. Both attempt to explain the same events. Yet they lead to remarkably different conclusions about the identity of Judas Iscariot. The first interpretation is the traditional one, preserved within the canonical Gospels and embraced by the overwhelming majority of Christian history. According to this view, Judas was a disciple who failed. The historical record shows that the earliest surviving Christian sources consistently associate him with betrayal. He agrees to hand Jesus over to the authorities. He receives payment. His actions contribute directly to the arrest in Gethsemane. From this perspective, Judas becomes a warning about the dangers of greed, disillusionment, and spiritual collapse. The strength of this interpretation lies in the evidence itself. The canonical narratives are earlier than the Gospel of Judas and appear closer to the traditions circulating among the first generations of Christians. Many scholars therefore regard them as the strongest available sources for reconstructing the historical memory of Judas. Yet this interpretation faces a difficulty. If the crucifixion was essential to the divine plan, then Judas occupies a paradoxical position. He is condemned for performing an action that ultimately contributes to the event at the center of Christian salvation history. This does not invalidate the traditional view, but it creates a theological tension that has never been fully resolved. The second interpretation emerges from texts such as the Gospel of Judas and certain streams of Gnostic thought. Here, Judas is not the disciple who understands least. He is the disciple who understands most. Some scholars argue that this portrayal reflects a radically different theological framework in which secret knowledge is valued above public obedience. Within that framework, Judas becomes the only follower capable of carrying out a painful but necessary task. The strength of this interpretation lies in its ability to address the paradox of necessity and betrayal. It offers a coherent explanation for why Judas might appear to act against Jesus while simultaneously serving a larger purpose. Yet the weaknesses are equally significant. The Gospel of Judas was written generations after the events it describes and reflects a distinct theological agenda. Most historians do not treat it as direct evidence for the historical Judas. Instead, they view it as evidence for how certain later communities interpreted him. This leaves us with an intriguing situation. One theory possesses earlier textual support but struggles with a philosophical paradox. The other addresses that paradox but rests upon a much later source. The evidence suggests that neither interpretation completely eliminates the challenges posed by the other. Some scholars continue to favor the traditional understanding. Others remain fascinated by the alternative. And perhaps the most important realization is that both interpretations are attempting to answer the same underlying question. What was Judas actually trying to do? Was he a failed disciple who misunderstood his teacher? Or was he a misunderstood disciple whom history never fully understood? When investigating a figure such as Judas, historians eventually encounter a frustrating reality. Unlike kings, emperors, or military commanders, Judas left behind no palace, no inscription, no tomb that can be confidently identified, and no surviving artifact bearing his name. The archaeological record cannot place us face to face with the historical Judas. Yet absence of direct evidence does not mean the investigation ends. Instead, it shifts toward the echoes that remain scattered across landscapes, manuscripts, and cultural memory. The strongest archaeological connection to our story comes not from first-century Judea, but from the deserts of Egypt. There, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, fragments of ancient Christian literature survived conditions that destroyed countless other texts. Among these discoveries was the manuscript known today as the Gospel of Judas. The surviving codex itself dates to approximately the 3rd or 4th century and was written in Coptic, though scholars believe it may preserve a Greek text composed earlier. As an artifact, the manuscript does not prove the historical claims contained within it. Archaeology rarely works that way. Instead, it proves something equally important. It proves that communities existed who preserved and valued this interpretation of Judas strongly enough to copy and protect it. The manuscript is evidence for belief, even if it is not direct evidence for the events it describes. Beyond Egypt, other archaeological discoveries provide context rather than confirmation. The caves near Nag Hammadi yielded collections of Gnostic writings that reveal a vast intellectual world operating alongside emerging Orthodox Christianity. These texts speak of hidden knowledge, cosmic hierarchies, and spiritual awakening. They help us understand the cultural environment in which a text like the Gospel of Judas could emerge. Yet they do not independently verify its narrative. They function more like neighboring voices in the same conversation. Jerusalem itself offers another layer of archaeological resonance. Excavations have uncovered first-century streets, ritual baths, burial practices, and architectural remains that illuminate the world in which Jesus and his disciples lived. These discoveries cannot identify Judas personally, but they anchor the gospel narratives within a recognizable historical landscape. Stone stairways worn smooth by countless feet, market districts crowded with pilgrims, temple courts filled with religious debate. Such places remind us that behind every theological argument stood real human beings moving through real cities. Art and visual culture provide another kind of archaeological echo. Medieval frescoes, mosaics, illuminated manuscripts, and church sculptures repeatedly depict Judas in distinctive ways. These images are not historical evidence for the 1st century. They are cultural memory preserved in pigment and stone. They reveal how successive generations understood his role and how that understanding evolved over time. In many cases, they tell us more about the societies that produced them than about Judas himself. This distinction is crucial. The historical record shows one thing. Cultural memory often shows another. The archaeological evidence therefore leaves us with a nuanced conclusion. We possess no artifact that can definitively explain who Judas was. What we do possess are traces left behind by communities who argued about him, painted him, condemned him, defended him, and transformed him into a symbol. These echoes do not solve the mystery. Yet together they reveal something remarkable. Long after the historical man disappeared, the debate surrounding him became an artifact in its own right, preserved across manuscripts, ruins, and memories that continue to survive long after their creators have vanished. To understand why the figure of Judas became so controversial, we must step inside the theological imagination of the ancient world. Modern readers often approach religious texts as repositories of information, asking what happened and whether it happened. Ancient audiences frequently asked a different question. What does this event reveal about the structure of reality itself? For the first generations of Christians, the story of Jesus was not merely the biography of a teacher. It was an explanation of how heaven and earth, the visible and invisible realms, humanity, and the divine were connected. Within that worldview, every major character carried theological significance. Peter represented faith and leadership. Thomas represented doubt and certainty. Judas represented something far more difficult to define: The historical record shows that early Christian communities were wrestling with profound questions about freedom, responsibility, and divine providence. If God guides history toward a purpose, how much freedom do human beings truly possess? If a divine plan exists, can individuals still be held morally accountable for the roles they play within it? These questions were not unique to Christianity. Similar tensions can be found throughout Jewish thought, Greek philosophy, and other religious traditions of the ancient Mediterranean. Yet the story of Judas concentrated these concerns into a single dramatic figure. In the canonical tradition, Judas became a theological symbol of failed discipleship. He stands close to the sacred and yet turns away from it. His story demonstrates that proximity to truth is not the same as acceptance of truth. This interpretation served an important function for early Christian communities seeking to define loyalty, faithfulness, and communal identity. But alternative traditions approached the same theological landscape differently. Certain Gnostic texts viewed the material world itself as a place of confusion and spiritual exile. Within such systems, salvation was often understood not primarily as forgiveness, but as awakening. Knowledge became a sacred act. Ignorance became a form of bondage. In this context, Judas could be reinterpreted as a figure associated with revelation rather than betrayal. The evidence suggests that these radically different portrayals emerged because different communities were attempting to answer different theological questions. One asked, "How should a disciple remain faithful?" The other asked, "How does a soul awaken to hidden truth?" Neither question was trivial. Each reflected a distinct understanding of humanity's deepest problem. Theological significance therefore extends beyond the historical Judas himself. He became a vehicle through which ancient believers explored the relationship between appearance and reality, obedience and understanding, destiny and choice. The difficulty with reducing Judas to a simple hero or villain is that doing so collapses the larger theological conversation unfolding around him. The strongest evidence from the surviving texts suggests that ancient readers were not merely debating one man's actions. They were debating the nature of salvation, the meaning of suffering, and the role of human agency within a universe believed to be guided by divine purpose. My reading of the evidence is that Judas endured as a theological puzzle because he occupied the fault line between two competing intuitions. On one side stood the conviction that human beings are responsible for their choices. On the other stood the belief that history unfolds according to a larger design. The tension between those ideas remains unresolved. And perhaps that is precisely why the figure of Judas continues to provoke reflection long after the world that first debated him has disappeared. As our investigation approaches its deepest layer, the figure of Judas begins to recede into the background. Not because he becomes less important, but because he reveals something larger than himself. This often happens when studying ancient religious traditions. A character first appears as an individual within a story, only to become a doorway into questions that extend far beyond biography. The ancient world was filled with uncertainty. Empires rose and collapsed. Cities flourished and disappeared beneath sand and ruin. Human life was brief, fragile, and vulnerable to forces that seemed impossible to control. Disease, famine, war, and death stood at the edge of every horizon. In such a world, people searched not merely for survival, but for meaning. They wanted to understand why suffering existed. They wanted to know whether history possessed direction or whether events unfolded without purpose. They wanted to know what happened after death and whether the visible world concealed a deeper reality beyond human perception. It is within this context that the story of Judas acquires philosophical significance. At its heart lies a question about knowledge itself. How much can a human being truly understand about the forces shaping destiny? Ancient religious literature repeatedly returns to this problem. Prophets receive visions they only partially comprehend. Kings act without seeing the consequences of their decisions. Entire nations participate in events whose significance becomes visible only generations later. Human beings move through history surrounded by mysteries they cannot fully grasp. The figure of Judas stands at the center of one such mystery. Was he acting out of greed, disappointment, conviction, obedience? The historical record offers possibilities, but not certainty. This uncertainty is important because it confronts us with the limits of knowledge. The evidence suggests many things. It proves very little beyond dispute. Ancient thinkers understood this limitation well. Wisdom literature across the Mediterranean world often portrays humanity as standing at the edge of a vast and incomprehensible order. The stars move according to patterns beyond human control. Divine purposes remain partially hidden. Mortals perceive fragments while longing for the whole. This longing appears again and again within religious texts, philosophical schools, and mystical traditions. It is the desire to see beyond appearances, to understand what lies behind suffering, sacrifice, and death. Some traditions sought answers through revelation, others through philosophy, others through ritual and contemplation. Yet all shared a common recognition. Human understanding has boundaries. The deeper one investigates reality, the more one encounters mystery. Perhaps this is why Judas continues to provoke reflection centuries after the disappearance of the world that first debated him. He represents more than a disputed historical figure. He represents the unsettling possibility that events may contain meanings invisible to those participating in them. The strongest evidence available to any generation may still leave unanswered questions. Theological systems may offer explanations. Philosophical frameworks may provide coherence. Yet the horizon of complete certainty remains distant. My reading of the evidence is that the enduring power of this story lies not in its answers, but in its tension. Between knowledge and ignorance. Between destiny and freedom. Between what human beings believe they understand and what remains hidden beyond their reach. And it is precisely within that tension that much of ancient humanity located its search for the sacred. After following the evidence through manuscripts buried beneath desert sands, through theological disputes preserved in ancient texts, through symbols painted onto monastery walls and questions debated by generations of scholars, we arrive at the point where every serious historical investigation must eventually pause. Not because every mystery has been solved, but because the available evidence has carried us as far as it can. The historical record shows that Judas was remembered as the disciple who handed Jesus over to the authorities. The earliest surviving Christian traditions consistently preserve that memory. Archaeological discoveries, including the Gospel of Judas, reveal that later communities developed alternative interpretations that challenged or reimagined his role. The textual evidence demonstrates that these competing narratives genuinely existed. The scholarly debate concerns what those narratives actually tell us. Do they preserve traces of forgotten historical traditions? Or do they primarily reflect the theological concerns of the communities that produced them? The strongest evidence suggests caution. The Gospel of Judas remains an invaluable historical artifact, but it is not a direct eyewitness account. It tells us with remarkable clarity how some ancient believers understood Judas. It does not allow us to reconstruct his life with certainty. Yet something fascinating emerges when we step back and examine the larger picture. Across all these traditions, whether hostile or sympathetic, Judas never disappears. His role remains indispensable. The villain remains in the story. The misunderstood disciple remains in the story. The warning remains in the story. The mystery remains in the story. This persistence may be more revealing than any single interpretation. Historical figures are often forgotten. Symbols endure. Judas became one of those symbols. Not because ancient people agreed about him, but because they could not agree about him. Some saw moral failure. Others saw tragic necessity. Some saw betrayal. Others saw obedience misunderstood by history. The difficulty with choosing only one interpretation is that each illuminates something important while leaving something unexplained. The traditional view possesses stronger historical foundations, but leaves unresolved questions concerning providence and necessity. The alternative view addresses some of those questions, but depends upon later theological developments. Neither interpretation completely silences the other. My reading of the evidence is that the most significant discovery made during this investigation has little to do with proving whether Judas was secretly innocent or unquestionably guilty. The deeper revelation concerns the way ancient communities used his story to explore questions that extended far beyond a single individual. What is the relationship between freedom and destiny? Can a person participate in a larger purpose without fully understanding it? How should responsibility be judged when actions produce consequences greater than their intentions? These questions lie beneath every layer of the debate. The historical Judas may remain partially hidden behind the limitations of our sources. Yet the conversation surrounding him reveals something enduring about the human search for meaning. We long to find coherence within suffering. We seek purpose within tragedy. We attempt to understand how individual choices fit within narratives larger than ourselves. Yet the debate remains open. The archaeological record cannot fully answer these questions. The surviving texts do not eliminate ambiguity. The evidence points in several directions at once. And perhaps that is the final revelation. The greatest historical mysteries are rarely those that conceal information. They are the ones that continue to reveal new questions every time we believe we have reached an answer. The investigation is ending. The manuscripts have been examined. The competing theories have been weighed. The fragments of evidence have been gathered from deserts, libraries, ruined monasteries, and the fading memory of ancient communities. Yet, as often happens in the study of history, the closer we move toward an answer, the more clearly we begin to see the boundaries of what can be known. Somewhere in the 1st century, a man named Judas Iscariot lived and died. Beyond that simple statement, certainty begins to dissolve. We possess texts. We possess traditions. We possess interpretations layered upon interpretations. But the historical individual remains hidden behind nearly 2,000 years of theological reflection, artistic imagination, and cultural memory. The archaeological record preserves traces of the debate. The textual record preserves arguments. Theological systems preserve meanings. Yet none of them allow us to hear Judas speak in his own voice. And perhaps that silence is itself significant. Throughout our journey, one pattern has appeared again and again. Every generation seems to create a different Judas. The Judas of the canonical Gospels. The Judas of the Gnostics. The Judas of medieval art. The Judas of theologians. The Judas of historians. Each version reveals something about the people who interpreted him, their fears, their hopes, their understanding of justice, destiny, and salvation. The historical figure remains elusive, but the symbolic figure grows larger with every century. This raises a question that reaches beyond the boundaries of this particular story. When history remembers an individual primarily through narratives written by others, where does the person end and the symbol begin? Ancient civilizations wrestled constantly with this problem. Heroes became legends. Kings became myths. Teachers became archetypes. Over time, memory transformed people into vessels for ideas larger than themselves. Perhaps Judas experienced the same fate. The evidence suggests that the debate surrounding him is not merely a disagreement about one disciple. It is a disagreement about how human beings understand responsibility itself. If an action contributes to a larger purpose, does that change its moral meaning? If a person becomes necessary to the unfolding of history, does necessity alter judgment? Ancient theologians explored these questions through the language of providence. Philosophers approached them through discussions of fate and free will. Mystics approached them through hidden knowledge and revelation. None arrived at a universally accepted answer. The debate remains open because the problem itself remains unresolved. My reading of the evidence is that the enduring mystery of Judas survives precisely because it touches a question larger than theology, larger than history, perhaps even larger than religion itself. It asks whether human beings can ever fully understand the meaning of their own actions while they are living through them. The people of the ancient world looked toward the heavens, searching for answers. They studied sacred texts. They listened to prophets. They contemplated the movement of history. Yet even they often concluded that the deepest realities remained partially veiled. And so we arrive at the final question. Not whether Judas was a traitor, not whether he was misunderstood, but whether history has remembered the man at all. Or whether, somewhere along the long passage of centuries, the real Judas disappeared beneath the weight of the questions that later generations needed him to carry.